And this should now hand over to you as host.
I think we have to act slow.
Okay.
I think you might have to click on something, Gwen. It's to agree to be recorded. We're not being recorded, don't we? So just agree.
If I could ask everyone now, apart from Hannah, to mute their devices, we'd be immensely grateful.
Okay.
Yep, screen sharing is working, Hannah.
Okay, so can you see, and can I move, and if I've moved on, can you see that we've moved on from a home screen to a contents page?
At the moment, it just says you're viewing Hannah to a screen and it appears to be us again. But let me just...
Oh,
We were able to see Hannah's presentation.
Were you?
Yes.
That's helpful. Okay, I'll leave it with Hannah now. Over to you, Hannah.
Okay. Thank you. So the key question is whether given the way it's set up, whether when I move a slide on, you can see that a slide has moved on. So if this, I'll tell you when I've moved a slide on, and
terrible code, you said.
okay, if somebody would just shout if you still see what you thought you were looking at. Okay. Okay, are we there? So you can now see my home's title page, can you, David?
Yes, we can.
And can you now see one that starts key themes for this
It's
evening?
moved on to key themes for this evening.
Brilliant. Well, first test complete. Well, welcome everyone. It's really good to be with you all this evening for the first of these 5 sessions, which will be exploring the English Reformation or the English Reformations. That's a question we'll keep coming back to. What we hope to do over these 5 sessions is to get a sense of the shape of religious change in England between approximately the beginning of the 16th century and approximately the middle of the 17th century. We'll explore a story of tumultuous back and forward change of how England went from a Catholic country, a vibrantly Catholic country, to a Protestant country engaged in Protestant civil conflict, where in 1649, English Protestants would kill a Protestant king. A number of themes will recur and emerge as we explore this story, as we look at a story that is both about religion, but is about dynastic politics and economics, and all kinds of other factors that played into the politics of the early modern English church and nation. Our main focus will be on England. But obviously we can't consider England in a vacuum, in isolation from the cultural, religious and political movements and factors that were at play across Europe. So at various points, we'll be spending some time on the wider European perspective. We could do a different course looking at European Reformations. And alongside it all, particularly from the middle of the 16th century, there's a different but interweaving story to tell about England's nearest geographical neighbour, certainly my part of England's nearest geographical neighbour, the very different Reformation that was happening in Scotland. As you'll have seen from the course outline, we're going to explore this broadly chronologically, but some of those divisions are a little bit arbitrary. And so we'll approach that chronology as framework rather than being absolutely strict about it. This evening's session will look primarily at the church on the eve of the Reformation. Then next week we'll go along to look at the Henrician Church, the church under Henry VIII, and the break with Rome. In the third session, we'll look at Reformation and Counter-Reformation, Edward VI and Mary Tudor, what some of our older textbooks call the mid-Tudor crisis. In session 4, we'll look at the Elizabethan Church, the great chunk of time that was the second half of the 16th century, in which we will argue that it is then that England really became a Protestant country. And then in the final session, we'll look at the church in the early half of the 17th century, the early Stuart Church, in which England's Reformation was reimagined in ways which led, if not solely caused, conflict. So this evening, we've got a general introduction that I've outlined. There's a question that we'll keep coming back to over the coming weeks, which is what sort of church was the English church in 1500, under Henry, under Edward, under Mary, under Elizabeth, in 1630, in 1640, and so on. So that's one question we'll keep coming back to. What sort of church was the English church? We'll also spend a bit of time reflecting on where we think the motivation for religious change came from, to pick up on a debate that has recurred in the scholarship of the English Reformation over recent decades. We'll think about whether it was a top-down Reformation imposed by royal authority, or a bottom-up one led by popular demand for change, popular motivation for change. And then we'll pick up on themes from more recent scholarship, which has paid attention to the experience of religious change across the 16th century. Not just what did kings do, who went to war with whom, that kind of thing, but what did it feel like to live through all of this? And how did people negotiate and accommodate their changing realities, their changing religious landscape? So we'll do that. We'll spend a bit of time looking at Europe in 1500, at the cultural and intellectual background. And then we'll pause, we'll gather up any comments or questions for clarification. Then we'll turn our attention specifically to England and English religion on the eve of the Reformation, as we start to look ahead to what happened in the second, third, and fourth decades of the 16th century. And also suggest some things that you might want to look at further if you're interested. Just before we move on to the map, it's really just that you've got something to look at. Just going to give a note on some terms. It's helpful if we can be clear what we're talking about or what we think we're talking about at any given time. And there are various terms and phrases that I will use and use quite liberally as I talk. So these are some of my working definitions. I can share these later, so don't worry about writing down every word I say. So when I talk about the early modern period or early modern Europe, I am basically talking about the period between about 1450 and about 1700, possibly 1750, depending on where you look. It's a general catch-all term, and it's simply to talk about that chunk of chronological time. When I talk about the Reformation, I'm referring broadly to the process of religious change that the Western Church experienced in the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. But I've already spoken about reformations, because the Reformation was not one thing, one monolithic process. So we'll nuance it a bit. Starting in Europe first. When we talk about or think about the magisterial Reformation, we're talking about the mainstream Protestant religious change that began initially in Germany and in Switzerland. So we're basically talking about Luther and Zwingli and Calvin. Alongside that, I'll refer, but not very much in this course, to the Radical Reformation, what in older scholarship is referred to generally as Anabaptism. These were radical religious movements, mainly in Germany, that were very different within the landscape of emerging Protestantism. They called into question the authority of the earliest church in the ways that none of the mainstream reformers did. So called into question the historic creeds, things like that, and or existing social order. People were afraid, largely, of radical Reformation in Europe. Then alongside that, we've got what we might call the Catholic or counter-Reformations. These were the reformist movements within the Roman Church that developed both parallel to and then particularly in response to the growth of Protestantism. So we've got different versions, different theological types of Reformation going on in the European theological landscape. But it's quite hard to know, particularly in the earliest period, how to talk about people who are interested in reforming ideas, showing what we might call reforming tendencies, but certainly aren't confessional Protestants. And so for the early part of the 16th century, especially when we're talking about Henrician England, I'll talk about evangelicals. By evangelicals, I don't mean what we mean when we talk about evangelical Anglicans or evangelical Protestants today, particularly. What it simply means is people who are showing an interest in reform, who are showing an interest in the Bible in English and in the writings, particularly of Luther. Later on, when I come to talk about non-Lutheran Protestants, I'll talk about Reformed with a capital R, Reformed Protestants, rather than Calvinists. If and when I talk about Calvinists, it's referring specifically to people who follow the teachings of John Calvin, who practice Genevan church discipline, rather than, as in some of the older scholarship, using it as a word to mean any version of Protestant who isn't a Lutheran Protestant. So we've got, in England, in the early period, we've got evangelicals, then we've got Reformed Protestants, alongside that we've got Lutheran Protestants. There's a word that certainly for the 16th century I will not be using at all, and that is Anglican. There were not any Anglicans in 16th century England, apart from arguably, as we might think about later, Elizabeth I herself. But the 16th century Church of England, whatever sort of church it was by no means Anglican in the way that we think about Anglicanism now. There'll be some more phrases, some more terms to encounter, particularly as we make our way later into the Elizabethan and early Stuart Church. But that's enough for now, and we can come back and clarify things as we go. So, having figured out what all these religious groups might or might not have been, what did Europe in 1500 look like? So Europe in 1500 looked something like this. I'm just going to move you so that I can see the map a little better. What you've got in the middle of Europe, modern Germany, modern Czech Republic, modern Hungary, up onto the Baltic littoral, is the Holy Roman Empire. That came down into the modern day Netherlands and Belgium, and then made its way down towards northern Italy. The Holy Roman Empire, which is often referred to in shorthand as Germany, was not post-unification Germany by any stretch of the imagination. The Holy Roman Empire consisted of city-states, and the Holy Roman Emperor was elected by 7 electors, though it has to be noted that they consistently elected the Habsburg candidate before them. But so this Holy Roman Empire was a sort of federation. It was very, very, very plural, and obviously, as you can see from the map, covered a vast amount of Central and into Western Europe. Then you've got Hungary and Bohemia. These become very significant because of their place on the frontier with the Ottoman Empire. We'll come back to that shortly. Over here, obviously, we've got what we tend to call Italy. Italy, as we know it now, did not really exist. There were the Papal States, there was Florence, Milan, various other city-states, the Venetian Republic at the top, and the Kingdom of Naples at the bottom. Italy had been the site of conflict from 1494 onwards through and remained so through into the middle of the 16th century. Conflict that was basically dynastic conflict being played out between the Valois kings of France and the Habsburgs, who ruled both the Holy Roman Empire and also Spain. Spain also existed as separate kingdoms of Aragon and Castile. But then in 1516, Charles V, as he became, inherited both kingdoms, became King of Spain by virtue of inheriting both Aragon and Castile. Aragon included Sicily. Sicily was the sort of breadbasket of Southern Europe at that time. And then in 1519 was elected Holy Roman Emperor. So you can see from the map that Valois France is very much surrounded by Habsburg territory. And one of the constant themes in the conflict that develops in the early part of the 16th century is about the concern for both France to expand and also the Habsburg desire to protect their supply routes between their northern territories, particularly in the modern day Low Countries and Netherlands, and Spain. Later on, that becomes an issue when there's revolt, uprising in the Netherlands, and we'll come to that when we come to talk about Elizabeth. So Italy, for shorthand, there are huge numbers of changing political alliances. People change sides and can form federations and confederations on a remarkably regular basis. In the midst of all of this, it's important to remember that the French crown had a historic dynastic claim to the Kingdom of Naples. And that claim they continue to pursue periodically throughout the early part of the 16th century. On the eastern border, in Southeast Europe and to the Eastern Mediterranean, there's the ongoing pressure from the Ottoman Empire. One of the themes that recurs, and it recurs whether wherever you look in Europe, in the midst of all the religious conflict that Europe undergoes in the 16th century, is an awareness of the threat from the Ottoman Turks, and a sense that even though Western Christendom is divided, there is the need to protect it from the threat posed by the Ottoman Turks, who of course were Muslim. Then finally we get to England. England was much more centralized than most of the rest of Europe. We've already seen how Italy was a collection of different states, how the Holy Roman Empire was a collection of different city-states, how France was still much more fragmented than it is now. But England was pretty centralized. And that was largely as a result of what had followed the Tudor victory at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. The background from the 15th century was of significant dynastic conflict in the Wars of the Roses, massive instability. And then in 1485, when Henry Tudor, defeated Richard III on Bosworth Field and claimed the crown, all the emphasis is on stability. It's on stability and centralisation. The late great Sir Geoffrey Elton talked of the Tudor Revolution in government, and that becomes a factor. This centralisation, this effective government system becomes a factor that we can observe at different stages of the English Reformation story. It is important to note that Parliament did not routinely sit in 15th century England, turn of the 16th century. Parliament basically only sat when the king needed to raise taxes. The king largely only needed to raise taxes when he wanted to go to war. So there's no kind of standard sitting of Parliament in the way that there develops in the course of the 16th century and as we understand it now. But one of the emphases, one of the effects of that emphasis on stability becomes about the succession, which becomes, as many people here will be fully aware, key to what happens in the story we'll tell next week about Henry VIII and the break with Rome. Henry VII, having seized the crown on the battlefield, managed to hand it on peacefully to his son, also Henry, in 1509. It was basically the first time for a century that any English king had successfully done that. And so the imperative to secure the succession becomes absolutely key to the Tudors' understanding of monarchy, of what it means to rule England. We'll come back to that multiply. And then there's a wider context, which is the expansion beyond Europe that England, that Europe has known during the course of the 15th century, the discovery of the so-called New World. So that's the political, that's the kind of political, geopolitical concern. So what does the religious landscape of Europe look like? Western Europe was basically Catholic. It basically owed its religious allegiance to the Pope, who was both, as we can see from that map, both a spiritual ruler and also a political player in the dynastic and geopolitics of Europe. Throughout the Middle Ages, there had been various movements, various reform movements, which typically generally get labelled as heterodox or heretical, which had challenged mainstream church doctrine and or practice. Most significant from the English perspective were the Lollards of the 14th century, who were at least loosely connected with the Bible translator John Wycliffe, who died in 1384. Wycliffe in turn was influential on Jan Hus, the Czech reformer who was burned at the stake in 1415, and whose teachings provide at least some of the background for Luther's challenge and the way in which Luther's challenge is taken up in the early 16th century. So it's important to realise that there'd been challenge to the Roman Church that had been suppressed at various points. But it's also important to realise in that connection that reforming movements within the Western Church were not at all uncommon. Calls for reform happened throughout and in every generation. So at the very eve of the Reformation in 1512, the Fifth Lateran Council called for the reform of the Church in capite et membris, in head and members. And throughout the whole foregoing period, various renewal movements, including those of different religious orders during the later Middle Ages, typically emphasised the importance of church reform. Critiques of the church, of aspects of its doctrine, of aspects of its practice, of clericalism or of corruption or whatever else it might be, were not new in the 16th century. And also in that connection, important to realise, is that there were things, practices, beliefs that became controversial in the course of the 16th century that hadn't been controversial particularly before, and had been well within the bounds of accepted Catholic, if that's a helpful term, Western Church religious opinion and practice. And one such example, key example, is the Bible in the vernacular. It's just so the version of the Bible used in medieval Europe was the Vulgate. The Latin translation produced by St. Jerome back in the 4th century. In England, the association of the English Bible with Lollardy, with that heterodox movement somehow connected with John Wycliffe, led to it being suppressed and forbidden. And that's part of the story we'll tell next week when we come to think about Henry VIII, William Tyndale, and the Bible in English. But this was not the case everywhere. It was not the Roman Church that prevented people having the Bible in the vernacular. It was the English government. And so there were various places in Europe, various countries in Europe, where earlier vernacular translations of the Bible were not controversial in the way that the early English Bible became in the 16th century. It is, however, certainly true that vernacular scripture, the Bible in one's own language, became a key part, an essential part of the early evangelical and reformist movements across Europe. There are three factors to bear in mind when we think about this. Firstly, to which I've already alluded, was the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Constantinople had for some considerable time sat as a Christian island in the midst of territory that had been taken incrementally over decades by the Muslim Ottoman Turks. When the city fell in 1453, there was a huge movement of people, but of early Christian texts and manuscripts in Greek and in Syriac to the west. This gave to the Western Church access to material that it hadn't known, that hadn't been known in Western Europe and Latin Europe, certainly since antiquity. And this new influx of material, this wider access to text, to different texts, to variant versions of texts, led scholars to look again at some of the texts that were familiar, including the text of the New Testament in Greek. So that's one factor. The related factor is the cultural movement of Renaissance humanism. Beginning in Italy, inspired by the evidence of the classical past that was all around, humanists started to look at texts in a new way, with a particular interest in, emphasis on, going ad fontes, back to the sources. And the text of the Bible was, to these textual critics, no exception. Let's go back, let's look at alternative manuscripts and texts and see where we get to. And then thirdly, in a coincidental technological development, in 1450, the printing press was invented by Johannes Gutenberg, and that revolutionized the possibilities for communication, for access to material, and for dissemination of ideas in ways that just hadn't been known before that in Europe, and in ways that analogous to the way in which the internet has done in our own day. One particularly significant figure in all of this connection was Erasmus of Rotterdam. There he is, so you can look at him, oh dear, we'll go back again. So born in Rotterdam in the Low Countries in probably 1469, but nobody's entirely sure, died in 1536, wrote to everybody in Europe. He was the greatest letter writer of his day. In 1516, he published his version of the Greek New Testament, the Novum Instrumentum Omne, printed in Basel. There you are, there's a printed version of it. That sits in the British Library now. And subsequent editions were published in 1519 and then again in 1522, and later editions of the text as well. So Erasmus's Greek New Testament coincided, obviously, with the beginning of Luther's protest against the Catholic Church. And the new availability of the Greek text of the New Testament led people to look again at the Vulgate text and to question doctrines and practices which had relied heavily on particular readings of the Latin text. The most obvious example would be from the beginning of the Synoptic Gospels, when Jesus says, "Repent, for the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven is at near." it is near or is at hand, depending on which gospel you're reading. In the Latin text, the verb is to do penance. The Greek text, as we're mainly aware from many, many sermons on the subject, is metanoia, to turn around, to repent. So this led those who were already critical of the Roman Church to say, well, all this stuff about sacramental penance isn't there in the text of the New Testament. Now, this sort of critique doesn't itself constitute Reformation. It wasn't the simple monocause of the beginning of Europe's Reformation, but it was a factor in it. It was the cultural air people were breathing, and it contributed to the effectiveness of Luther's critique of traditional doctrine and practice, which really kicked off from October 1517 with his public challenge of the practice of selling of indulgences, though probably not actually, sadly, for historians, by nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. So all these factors come together, and at a moment of critique, something happens which in previous moments of critique of religious doctrine and practice, previous moments of challenge of the Roman Church simply hadn't happened. We'll come back to indulgences, to the whole system of purgatory in a few minutes' time. But I'm going to pause briefly and ask if anybody's got any questions or comments or anything you want clarifying, just to stick it into the chat, and we can either pick it up now or at the end of the session. And if there isn't, I'll just have a sip of water before we move on. No, I'm not. Oh, we've got one. Question about what the Fifth Lateran Council decided. Not very much. They made lots of resolutions about the importance of clerical discipline and general things, but then not very much. And anything that they might have done got sort of lost in the ongoing religious conflict, ongoing conflict that was taking place in Italy, and then completely subsumed by the challenge posed by Luther and the outbreak of what we tend to call Protestant Reformation. But the sorts of resolutions they made were exactly the sorts of things that have been made time and time again about the importance of good clerical education, clerical discipline, of disciplining clergy who lived with their housekeeper, didn't adhere to the required discipline of celibacy, all those kinds of things. Absolutely it's a consistent narrative throughout, but it got completely lost in the course of conflict and in the course of the way the religious politics of the end of the decade developed. Does that help, Christopher? Okay. In which case, let's turn our attention more specifically to England. So, can you now see Revising the English Reformation? Two books. Excellent. So, one of the great questions about the English Reformation is what story we're telling. There was a traditional narrative, which I'm possibly slightly unfairly kind of using A.G. Dickens as an exemplar for, but it's representative, that was predicated on a story that told us that progress and Protestantism went together, and that the late medieval English church was moribund, ripe for reform, in which the general populace had little sense of affinity or loyalty to it. And in that story, there's a sharp distinction drawn between elite and popular religion, and most popular religious practice was described as superstitious, in scare quotes.
Yeah.
In the 1980s, beginning with Christopher Hayes' set of essays, The English Reformation Revised, but then most importantly in Eamon Duffy's Stripping of the Altars, which was first published in 1992, That story has been significantly revised. Duffy's book has been reissued in subsequent editions, but the story it tells has never really been challenged. And Eamon Duffy told a very different story, both about the late medieval church in England and about the nature of the religious change that took place in the middle decades of the 16th century. And he summarised his arguments as follows. He said, "It's my conviction and a central plank of the argument of the first part of this book that no substantial gulf existed between the religion of the clergy and the educated elite on the one hand, and that of the people at large on the other. I do not believe that it is helpful or accurate to talk of the religion of the average 15th century parishioner as magical, superstitious, or semi-pagan. Nor does it seem to me that the most interesting aspect of late medieval religion lay in the views and activities of those who, like the relatively small number of Lollards, rejected its central tenets and preoccupations. The 15th and early 16th centuries in England witnessed a period of massive catechetical enterprise on the part not only of the bishops and parochial clergy, whose responsibility it mainly was, but also on the part of members of religious orders and private individuals. The teachings of late medieval Christianity were graphically represented within the liturgy, endlessly reiterated in sermons, rhymed in verse treatises and saints' lives, enacted in the Corpus Christi and miracle plays, which absorbed so much lay energy and expenditure, and carved and painted on the walls, screens, bench ends, and windows of the parish churches. He argues that within the diversity of medieval religious opinions, there was a remarkable degree of religious and imaginative homogeneity across the social spectrum, a shared repertoire of symbols, prayers, and beliefs, which crossed and bridged even the gulf between literate and illiterate. As I say, that view has never really been substantially challenged. And so Duffy argues that traditional religion had about it no particular marks of exhaustion and decay, and says of the Reformation that it was a violent disruption and not the natural fulfillment of most of what was vigorous in late medieval piety and religious practice. So in the second half of the book, he then goes on to explore why it was that change went on to happen the way that it did. And as we come back to questions about what sort of church the English church was, we'll come back to some of those questions as well. So what did this vibrant late medieval English piety look like? It was centred on the Mass, celebrated in Latin and which people attended regularly but received rarely. For many people as rarely as once a year, usually at Easter. In England, particularly in the province of Canterbury, the most widespread liturgical use followed the Sarum use, the ancient rites developed in Salisbury. And that itself indicates something important to realise about the medieval Catholic Church. Everyone, everywhere in Europe worshipped in Latin. And what people did and it taught was more or less consistent. But there was diversity of liturgical practice. And it wasn't until later in the 16th century that there was one standard authorised order for the Mass. And as well as that Latin Mass, there was sermons and devotions in the vernacular that complemented, that went alongside the formal liturgical practice. That Eucharistic piety and devotion was expressed in other ways too. Corpus Christi, processions and plays developed, and they were part of the social fabric as well as strictly religious observance. And in many towns, there were guilds, fraternities, organisations of lay piety that existed to fund, to organise, as well as for people to develop their own religious lives together. So there was an interweaving of the formal liturgical, the doctrinal, and popular social practice. And that fed into the ways in which time was sacralised. The calendar, the interweaving of the liturgical and agricultural year, and some of that liturgical time, some of that ritual observance was very, very elaborate as ways of teaching the faith and helping people in a predominantly non-literate society to enter into the dramas and the mystery of the salvation stories. And the particular example we'd point to would be the liturgical and ceremonial observances for Holy Week. We can say more about that if anybody's interested. As well as the Eucharist, the cult of the saints, and especially of the Virgin Mary, was central. This was reflected and depicted in art, in statues, in stained glass windows, and in particular patterns of devotion. This wasn't about a world which saw the saints as more important than Christ, because focus on the imitation of Christ, and particularly on piety around, for instance, his passion, the 5 wounds, was also central. But the saints and devotion to the saints was a fundamental aspect of late medieval piety. And in England, there was a particular focus on the Virgin Mary. Related to all of that was the importance of pilgrimages, of shrines. They've recently restored one at Lichfield, and of relics, of the physical remnants of saints, of holy people, of holy places, things that connected the here and everyday to the holy. The major pilgrimage sites in England were Walsingham and the Shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury, but there were many, many more. Local saints, saints with particular local connections, and indeed where people, where the saints of the English church down the centuries had been buried. And then in all of this was the penitential system and the belief in purgatory. The picture we're now looking at is the doom painting in Holy Trinity Church in Coventry, which was only fairly recently rediscovered, probably about 15 years ago. It had been covered in white lime wash ever since the Reformation. And it was when they were doing some other restoration work that they uncovered this picture, excuse me. And such a doom painting above the chancel arch is what you would have seen if you went into many, many parish churches in late medieval England. You've got Christ enthroned, the Last Judgment, and the souls of the departed are going one way or the other. And within all of this is the importance of the belief in purgatory, in an economy of salvation where there remained a connection between the dead and the living, where the living could help the dead, speeding them on their way through purgatory, and where in turn the dead could pray for the living now. And what you did now could affect what happened to you or to your grandmother or to whomever in the hereafter. And so through practices such as pilgrimage, almsgiving, saying masses for the dead, the connection between the living and the dead was maintained. This is seen most dramatically, liturgically, in the endowment of chantry chapels, often lavishly decorated, richly endowed by local nobility, for the saying of masses for the dead. But it's also played out in almsgiving for the building of bridges, for the founding of schools, for the funding of hospitals, for lots and lots of things that make up the social welfare fabric of late medieval England. And central to all of this were, of course, the religious houses, monasteries, convents, abbeys and friaries, great and small, the length and breadth of the country, which was so fundamental to late medieval social and religious practice, as powerhouses of prayer, as major employers, as providers of medical care and education, as the place where most people would stop and stay if they were travelling, as well as themselves often as centres of pilgrimage and devotion. And the story of what happens to the religious houses of England will feature as a key part of next week's session, as we see how in the 1530s, in remarkably short order, they disappeared from the landscape, leaving largely only bare ruined choirs. So to conclude, what we see if we look at English religion at the beginning of the 16th century is a world in which traditional religious practice and devotion shaped and permeated more or less every aspect of life, social life, economic life, the calendar. All of this was shaped by the traditional teachings of the church. And this was something with which people engaged enthusiastically and vibrantly. Obviously, there have been many people for whom it was wallpaper, landscape, background, but there was significant popular buy-in to religious practice, to religious devotion. And there was a lot of devotional and catechetical material available in English. What was not available in English was the text of scripture. We're looking at all of this in a country that had emerged from the conflict and instability of the 15th century, but where the memories of those upheavals were fairly fresh. And with the accession of Henry VIII in 1509, this was an England keen to step out and play its part on the European stage. And here is the famous image of the Field of the Cloth of Gold, when Henry VIII and Francis I of France met to compare who was the best Renaissance prince in Europe, basically. And through the marriage of Catherine of Aragon, first to Henry VIII's elder brother Arthur, then to Henry himself, England was tied closely into the dynastic interests and conflicts of continental Europe. So England in the 16th century was not remote from continental Europe. It wasn't separate from it. It shared the common language of education and law in Latin. It shared a common religious framework. And England's closest trading links were with the Low Countries, with Flanders and Burgundy and the wealth that came from the wool trade. As Reformation got going on the continent, books and ideas, as well as wool, could be shipped across the Channel. So one of the things we'll see in the coming weeks is a story about the way in which the English Reformation developed differently in different areas of the country. We'll ask questions about why religious change happened quicker in some places than in others, why in some places it was much more top-down, why rebellions focused on different aspects of religious practice, some in favour of traditional religion, some seeking a more Protestant Reformation. And as we do this, we'll keep asking, what sort of church are we looking at? What sort of religion was the religion of the English through the decades of the period that we're calling the English Reformations? Thank you. Now, on the last slide, I've just got some brief suggestions for further reading. Did anybody want a bit more background? If you want something very short, you might want to look at Miranda Threlfall-Holmes's Essential History of Christianity, the relevant chapters. If you want something very much longer, you might turn to Dermot McCulloch, both the relevant chapters of his doorstop size History of Christianity, but also the more specific book that he wrote about the Reformation, and a phenomenally excellent, but I'm afraid another doorstop, is Peter Marshall's recent Heretics and Believers, A History of the English Reformation. There are many other things we might point to as general background and reading, but those would be some of my starting points and good suggestions, but I can make those available if anybody would like them. I'm going to stop screen sharing now and invite any comments or questions into the chat. Or if you've got a question, you can just type in the chat question and we can find you and you can unmute and talk.
So just didn't you think?
I can hear
Thank you,
somebody.
everybody.
If I could ask people to mute if they're not asking a question, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
And if I've stunned you all into silence, you can send me questions separately or later, or we can pick them up at the beginning of next week's session if they occur subsequently.
Is that a question from Paul? No? Yep.
Charlotte Paxton has got her hand up. Charlotte.
Yeah, hi, sorry, I just couldn't put my question on chat for some reason. I was just wondering, were there any fundamental liturgical changes during this period to reflect the growing awareness or increasing education?
Fundamental liturgical changes, no, but there was one of the things that particularly Duffy picks up on in his stripping of the altars is that there's a huge explosion, particularly once printing is available, of sort of primers, sort of brief introductory texts. There's a lot of preaching in the vernacular, but liturgical change tends to come later. Of course, one of the great difficulties of all of this, of any study of religion in the past at any point, is to determine what to try and narrow the gap, if you like, between what you know is supposed to be happening or is officially happening and what is actually happening locally in practice.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the difference between looking at the script of a play and looking at different, performances of it. So that is quite hard to know, particularly in the period before you've got widespread other textual witness to things.
Okay.
That,
All right.
that makes sense.
Thank you.
Gregory's waving.
Yeah, I do. I have a question. It's about clergy discipline.
Oh dear.
Well, so you said that in the Fifth Lateran Council that there was some sort of general resolution around the fact that there were clergy who were living with their housekeepers, in the same way that there has been that sort of understanding of the Reformation being a sort of ending of superstition and whatever. How widespread was clergy ill discipline and abuse of office?
It depends where you look. The English church was pretty well disciplined, but there were all kinds of, if you read sort of the anti-clericalist stuff that comes out, both from people like Erasmus, but also the more popular market stuff, and then the serious critique by Protestant reformers. Erasmus never becomes a Protestant. Erasmus stays within the Roman Church. There are concerns not only about clergy living with their housekeepers and passing on livings to their sons and things like that, but also about the buying and selling of offices, about pluralism. It depends when and where you look. One of the issues is that a lot of clergy livings were, as they've remained until, certainly until the early part of the 20th century, not really sufficient for lots of people to live on. So, people have to live on something, but also, if you look high up in the church, whether it's at Cardinal Wolsey in England or some of the particularly remarkable Renaissance popes, there is significant buying and selling of offices and pluralism, and so that all this anti-clericalist critique does come from somewhere, but it does depend on when and where you look.
Thank you. It's really helpful. I think there's a question from David.
David's asking in the chat, what needs were people seeking to address through their religious practices, and what were their concerns? There is a narrative which is not an entirely unreasonable one, which is that the primary concern was that this was a world in which there was a lot of fragility and a lot of death, and the ways in which popular piety changed in the decades after the Black Death, so in the latter half of the 14th century, would seem to suggest that there's something in that. This was a world in which lots and lots of people were very dependent on the weather, in which if you lost your livestock, you lost them. So historians like Keith Thomas, when he looked at religion and the decline of magic, and put significant emphasis on concerns about witchcraft, which do persist sporadically and differently in different places through the centuries of the Reformation, particularly in parts of Germany. So largely about mortality and about fragility and about survival, really. And I think that's reflected by the ways in which the liturgical and agricultural years become so closely interwoven popularly, and in the ways in which, you know, there are particular saints to whom people pray if they're, you know, taking a boat out onto the sea to fish, or crossing rivers, or doing things like that. You know, people will talk about there being an enchanted world, but the flip side of an enchanted world is that it can be quite a threatening one. And so I think it reflects that. Does that help? Yeah.
So it was, if you like, a way of dealing with an unpredictable world now, as much as an unpredictable future in eternity.
Yes, I would say so, yes. Yeah.
Any further questions for Hannah? Hannah, I thought it was really excellent. I really, really enjoyed it, and it was a great way into the next few weeks. So thank you for taking the time to prepare, you know, so thoroughly, and to share your skills with us. Really, yeah. I hope you'll be able to join us next week. Your session next week is on the Henrician Reformation. Is that correct, Hannah?
Yep. So Henry, the King's Great Matter, the break with Rome, the dissolution of the monasteries, divorced, beheaded, died, and all the rest of it.
That's excellent. Can I ask you to hand me back the host so I can give Dan his account back?
Oh, let's see. Good question.
Thank you for supporting this too. It's really wonderful that people come and join us for this too. So thank you, and have a lovely rest of the evening, and I hope to see some of you again next week.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
No.